Hello, everybody. We're going to have a serious discussion today about ableism. This sprung out from, I guess, the incident when Donald Trump was at his rally where only like 6,000 people showed up. Haha. And that was the funny part about it. And everybody was kind of focusing on this thing that he did or failed to do. I don't know if it was before the rally or after it, actually, or during, but where he couldn't pick up a glass of water, or he had to use two hands to pick up the glass of water. And also the responses to that. But before we get started, I hope everybody's having a good day. I want to just discuss with you what ableism is. Hi. Okay, so ableism is basically discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. It's a very simple thing to understand in that regard. So it can extend beyond discrimination, of course. It does include kind of this cultural atmosphere of a preference towards able-bodied people over people that have some sort of limitation. And also it can include both physical and mental disabilities or disorders. And so, just extend that discrimination or cultural, I guess, preference or cultural treatment of disabled persons over able-bodied persons. So Torrential Rage mentions that I discriminate against Trump based on his ability. You caught me. Right. So there's a lot of things to criticize Trump over, for sure. And I completely agree with that. And so that's why the response to me over this incident, and also something about like him not being able to go down a ramp, without kind of some assistance. This response to this is perplexing to me, especially if we're talking about the response from the quote unquote left. Of course, I don't think that people within the Democratic Party constitute the left. I really think that they are actually more center right. It's just really messed up in the United States as far as the political party affiliations are concerned. And unfortunately, people on the left only really have one major party to go to that's a real contender in elections, and that's the Democratic Party. Hi, FTW all day. I don't know if that means for the win or if it's just FTW. So there's that. And I don't really understand because there's so many other things to criticize the president over, right? I mean, I try to send out a tweet every day reminding people that in the United States, we still have immigrants in concentration camps. And so why don't we kind of bring that up instead of his inability to perform a task? Because what they're doing here by kind of poking at this is they're being ableist, right? They're basically associating a negative connotation with some sort of mobility or motor impairment that he may or may not have. And there's a lot of people that have problems holding glasses at various times that have motor disorders. And that's not something that should be negative, that there's no negative connotation there. It just is a thing that happens. And so it's super frustrating, right? To me, it is. I'm going to butcher this. Majufi says, lots on the left or the Dems are suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, which steals their ability to reason. Okay, so Aaron says, he mentions the definition again, and then it says, I feel like it's ableist to mock motor disorders because Trump might or might not. Oh, like I just said that. He's just repeating me. Okay, so let me give you some examples of things that I've experienced in my personal life. a lot of you, if you don't know, if you weren't here in the last stream, I have multiple sclerosis, and that is considered a motor disorder. So it can affect people's inability to walk, to perform tasks. It can affect people's even cognitive abilities from time to time. So it's no joke. It's a brain disorder, and it's whole brain. It can affect anywhere in the brain. So when I first went to graduate school, and this is kind of like one that just was not prepared to experience, to be perfectly honest. I basically was using some special, not special, but I had accommodations in place basically because of my disability. And it was my very first class. It was a NOVA, like analysis of variance. It was a statistics course. And I actually still did really well in the class, but I did not turn in my first assignment. And there were only 4 because it was a summer semester, 4 assignments to turn in. And I just missed the timing on the computer because we had to electronically upload it. And I thought we had to turn it in class, like manually turn it in. And so I had to like rush, try to find it and try to call people to try to get the thing uploaded because I left all the like electronic stuff at home. And I just didn't make it. Anyways, and per my accommodation, it stated that if like I needed an extra day on assignments, or if I missed a deadline, that I would get an extra day. And so I told her that, because you give all your professors what the accommodations are. They receive a letter from like the office that manages those things at the university. And she's first of all, she didn't accept the assignment. And so I got a 0 on that. So that pissed me off. But what made me actually angrier about this was she didn't accept the assignment. And her reasoning was, oh, it's not like you have something wrong with your brain. And of course, the accommodation stuff does not tell the professors what it is that you have. It just says that these are the accommodations that you need because of a disability. And I was just like, what? And because I'm me, I get more bold about things. And what happened is she was the primary person who teaches all the statistic courses, and I enjoy statistics. So I took like, I don't know, a lot, like 10 statistics courses. And she taught the majority of them. And so at some point, I think in one of the classes, I stayed after, and she was like packing up her stuff. And I told her about her having done that and me having MS. And I told her that you cannot assume what people do or do not have just because they may not look like they have something wrong with them. And that is being ableist. So that's an example of ableist in respect to, I guess, hidden conditions or hidden disabilities. It's a lot of time referred to is it's a disability that's not super apparent at first sight or anything like that. Maybe there's no walking difficulties, so they don't walk with a cane, they're not in a wheelchair, but maybe their cognition is slowed down for some reason. And so we just cannot assume these things. So that's also ableist in that regard. I'm just looking at comments right now. Torrential rage. I know this is sarcastic. I am fine with people with motor disorders as long as they are Democrats. So when I saw the reaction to what Trump was struggling with, I hope there's a member of Congress, and he's in the House, and I think he represents a district in California, but I cannot tell you for the life of me which one it is because I'm not in California. His name's Ted Lieu, and he has an ad made by his kids. I guess he mentioned like it's made by his kids, where he's just picking up a glass of water. Like, oh yeah, real good politicians pick up a glass of water, right? And he drinks it like that's like he's a boss or something like that. And and I just was like, I can't with this right now. And that's generally been the reaction, is people doing that shit or people showing other Democrats holding water. And I'm like, guys, concentration camps. This is not not important. And it's also ableist, and it's definitely demeaning towards people who have these issues. Because what you're implying again is that the good Democrats, the people on the left side of justice, even though they're not because they're Democrats, we know how to drink a glass of water and pick it up. Oh my goodness. I could not believe it. Gary Priestley, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, says, my 10-year-old last night asked me what MS was, and I struggled to explain. So that's something that I actually did not consider, because I don't think I explained to you what MS is. MS, it's called multiple sclerosis, and it is an autoimmune disorder and neurological disorder in one. And it's where your immune system, it gets out of balance and gets hyperactive and starts attacking these little things that help connect your neurons together, and like help communicate between your neurons. It's these myelin sheaths. And that's often what you see as far as the white matter in the brain is concerned, is that myelin. And they house the axon of neurons, which are the little tubes that kind of communicate with other neurons, and they kind of project off of the neuron itself. And so sometimes with people with MS, what happens is the communication between the neurons ends up slowing down because that myelin sheath is getting kind of torn away or eaten away by your immune system. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, and honestly most of the time, as your disease progresses, your neurons will sever, because the site of attack that your immune system ends up attacking, it can repeat that area of attack. But why do they call it multiple sclerosis? Well, just think of it as kind of what it says, multiple scars. Your brain does try to heal itself, so it builds up scar tissue in the brain. And those are these like little dots that you'll see in like an MRI image. And that's how they diagnose it. I'm not sure if they take other things to diagnose it now, because I had to have a lumbar puncture, which is a spinal tap, and that shit hurt. And the MRI, and that's how they kind of made the diagnosis. But I think, and don't quote me on this, I think they have some other ways or other things to do now to actually diagnose the condition. With the condition also, there are 4 different types of conditions, or guess of stages or manifestations of MS. One is like it doesn't really do anything. You might have an initial attack, but you'll never have it again. The second and most common one is relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And what that is that you go through periods of time where you're healthy, you seem fine, and periods of time where you're not, because that's when your autoimmune system decides to like go into hyperdrive, because you're not normally in hyperdrive all of the time. But at some point, you unfortunately will develop secondary progressive MS. And that's because your brain is just, it ends up getting too damaged over time. It's like kind of, it's a stage issue more than anything, or I guess a duration issue, like how long you've had the illness. If you've had it for a long time, you'll likely transition into secondary progressive. And that ends up being very, that's not a great stage to be in. There's primary progressive MS too that kind of mimics secondary progressive, but it was from the initial diagnosis, it was just all downhill from there. Whereas secondary progressive had the relapsing remitting beforehand, and then secondary progressive, and then it was all downhill from there. So you don't recover from relapses in secondary progressive or primary progressive. Mark K asks or mentions, my daughter has MS, and then asks, have you ever done a video on it? No, I've not. I have been, so I am not a social person. I'm sure that's pretty apparent. And so having MS to me and doing a video on it was just kind of like, oh, I'm not ready to put myself out there to people like that. And so that's why I haven't done a video on it. But, you know, I've gotten more confident. And so I've been willing to kind of talk with you guys about my condition and things like that. So I may very well do a video on it. May not, but, you know, you can always ask me some questions about it. Aaron A asked, what are some of the symptoms? So because it impacts a variety of areas of the brain, some of the symptoms could be, you know, being unable to pull words out of your brain. You know, the Joe Biden syndrome, where he's just like, meh, what's the word? That can happen. That's a cognitive manifestation, but that can be in so many different disorders and conditions. It's you wouldn't necessarily use that to diagnose or make a diagnosis of MS. Another thing, or I guess a more prominent thing, is muscle weakness, because it, for some reason, primarily attacks the motor areas of the brain. And so you might, that's when people have walking difficulties. You'll see some people with MS that walk with a cane or end up in a wheelchair because for some reason, the brain gets damaged in that area, and therefore you're unable to really make those movements anymore. And that can happen widespread in the body too. It's not just, you know, the legs. You can have finger issues. My fingers are where I have a lot of motor difficulties myself. And that's why I had to have accommodations, because I had to have people help me take notes. You guys have very hard like screen names here. And so again, if I mispronounce this, just let me know. Majufi asks, is your condition what led you to study brains? No. I was already doing that prior to being diagnosed. I was diagnosed while I was in college, undergraduate college, and I had already had I almost had my degree by that time. So it just happened to be kind of the thing that happened. And in fact, I didn't remember learning about MS when I took my class, because when I got diagnosed with it, I'm like, what the hell is that? And I was like freaking out, and I just didn't remember what it was. Majufi says that I have a learning disability / dyslexia, which I've heard might be a myelin issue. I don't know. I'm not really, familiar with dyslexia specifically, as far as what the brain mechanisms, I guess, involved. That could be something that I could definitely look up, because I'm curious about that now. So for instance, Majufi here, their problem, their disability here is hidden, right? Like, you would not know they had dyslexia unless they told you, or unless you kind of were told by someone, hey, this person has dyslexia, they're going to be a little bit slower regarding reading and things like that. But otherwise, they're fine. Communication issues are fine. Or I guess there are no issues really. It's hidden. And so that's something that, again, we need to take into account regarding this ableism stuff. Another example that I don't like, and I will tell people, like friends, for instance, who have known me for a bit, but don't know about my MS, when I disclose that to them, that I've had MS, or I still have MS actually, and where my disease progression has been and where I am today is different. So like I said, I think I mentioned in the last stream that I have to use a wheelchair from time to time, but less so than I had to like 5 or 6 years ago. I was primarily using a wheelchair. And before that, I was primarily using my cane when I walked. And now I walk pretty much independently, but there are days where I have, problems. But anyways, and then people will tell, and I do gymnastics, which is a very hard on your body kind of sport. I love the sport, and I hope to do it forever if I can. But I do gymnastics, so you would never guess that I ever had any mobility issues, or that I do still have mobility issues, based off of knowing me from the gym, or knowing that I do gymnastics. And then I often get in reply like, wow, that's amazing. That is very courageous, or something to that effect, where that's another form of ableism, because why is me just living my life courageous? Like, I don't understand that. It's kind of insulting. So just be aware of that too, that people don't, unless they tell you like, hey, this was a struggle for me and I'm proud of myself, or whatever, unless you know them very well, like, I guess, like your daughter, Mark, you might say that, you're proud of her for handling something well, or whatever. It's just not a welcome thing to have people say. And this is just my opinion, of course. And one more example that I have, and this was a conversation that I had on Twitter, of all places. And I primarily hang out with leftists on Twitter, Twitter Hangout, on Twitter. And in my kind of feed, I saw somebody mention like, oh, the environment is very much affected by sidewalks, and so therefore we should get rid of them and stop making them. Well, what is the problem here with this? If you think about it, just spend 2 seconds outside of your own abled body and think about why sidewalks would actually be useful for somebody, for wheelchairs. Because do you know how hard it is to get around in the mud, or on the gravel, or in the grass with a wheelchair? It's nearly impossible. And so sidewalks are a welcome thing to see, because that allows people in wheelchairs to have access to the things that able-bodied people have. And I did mention this to this person who said this. I said, hey, people in wheelchairs need sidewalks. They can't get around on the ground without it. They need a nice smooth surface to navigate and be able to access buildings and all those things. And they're like, "Oh my God, it's something I never even thought about. I'm so sorry." And oh, by the way, when I told the doc, I don't know if I mentioned this, but when I told the professor about having done this, she did apologize. So I'm not sure if I mentioned that. But people say dumb things because they don't know. And they don't have a perspective of what it feels like or how it is to navigate through your world when there are some limitations. I mean, I have limitations just by being a short person. I'm only 4'11", so, or I'm 5 feet according to my driver's license, but kind of 4'11". Don't tell the driver's license places. But so I'm short, and so I can't reach anything too. So not only do I have like motor issues sometimes with my legs, but then I'm like, I can't reach anything. And even when I'm in an ADA, like kind of apartment that has like lowered the what are those things called with the counter? Have lowered the counter. They don't lower the stupid cabinets. They don't lower their cabinets. And so that's a thing, by the way. So can you imagine being in a wheelchair and not being able to reach and use your cabinets effectively? You would need to live with another human being just to use the cabinetry. Mm. Raw, raw, sorry, raw Duran Baristov says true. They also need wheelchair accessible sidewalks. I think that's sidewalks. When I was growing up in the DR, our sidewalks were too high off the streets and had no ramps. Yes, I agree with that. There's a lot of sidewalks where I live that do that very thing. There are no ramps, but they're there. And I'm like, well, okay, the sidewalk is just for aesthetics then. What's the point of that? So yeah, I agree. And I wish cities and businesses would take into account these things, but in the state that I live in, there's really they're not obligated to, unless, yeah, they're essentially not really obligated to. It's a fight you will lose in this state. Rel mentions that my problem is that I am too tall with back problems. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people have different issues, and that's annoying when people don't consider those things. I'm supposed to be in an ADA apartment now. By the way, I'm finished moving. I'm still obviously unpacking things and trying to get set up, but I made it. So I moved to an ADA, supposedly ADA apartment. And when I had looked at the place, I had to tell them to make modifications to the place to make it ADA compliant. If you're going to tout that you have an ADA compliant apartment, it needs to be ADA compliant. And and when I had gone down here to look at the apartment, I'm like, no one in a wheelchair could move around this apartment independently. And so I said, hey, the carpet in the bedroom, it is shag carpet. Wheelchairs the carpet's too thick. So you can either have inability to move the chair, or you're going to tear up the carpet trying to move it. So they ripped up the carpet, and now they put a hard floor in. So I'm happy about that, because I didn't actually think that they would make that modification. That was the biggest one that I thought they wouldn't make. They didn't have a safety bar at the toilet. And I'm like, they had all these safety bars in the shower. Okay, great. But not at the toilet. And I had never, ever seen that before. To the balcony, there's a step. And if it's an ADA compliant apartment, you do not have full access to all of the apartment that you're supposed to have. And I told them, hey, people in wheelchairs cannot get up that step. Maybe they can go down it and hopefully they don't tip over, but they ain't getting back in. And they put a ramp in. So I was happy that they did make those modifications because I really did think that they weren't going to. And that, yeah, as Aaron mentioned, that was very ableist of them. Yeah, because they did not consult with people who have a disability, even maybe a hearing impairment or whatever it is. I could clearly tell that they did not actually consult with anybody who has a disability, which is also ableist if you think about it. People with disabilities should have a seat at the table or have a seat, have a say in the conversation, especially when constructing buildings, for instance, when constructing living spaces. It's wild to me that they wouldn't even have someone with a disability tell them these things. The apartment, as far as I know, has been here for a long time, the complex. And so that to me tells me that they've never, ever had a person with a disability in any of their ADA compliant apartments. So that's shocking too. Sean Hensley says, that's a good business idea, helping people come into compliance. You'd think, but a lot of businesses, it's can be costly to come into compliant. And so if businesses can get away with it, they will try anything to get away with it because capitalism. So that's just been my experience. That's been what I've read from other people's experiences. There's a disability rights organization, and that they've mentioned that too as an issue that a lot of businesses don't want to come into compliant because it is costly. It's costly to modify your bathroom. It's costly to modify your door space so that a wheelchair could fit through it. And I was watching something the other day where he was talking about, I don't remember what it was, but he was talking about construction work. And these construction workers, like building all new houses or all new businesses. I don't know what they were building, but it was obviously a series of things that they were building. And one of the construction persons come along. It's like, hey, we need to widen that door space. And one of the person who was telling the story was like, huh, why do we need to do that? And then the construction worker replied, well, if anybody comes into here to live and they have a disability, it is expensive for them to modify it. So if we go ahead and do that for them up front, they're good to go. Because those costs to modify things like your home to fit your needs, that goes on you. Your home builder, whatever, your developer, whatever it's called, the people who build houses, they do not make those accommodations usually. Often, most of the time, most like 99.9% of the time, they will not make those accommodations. Formerly Rod Line asks, just curious, by the way you said that, are you anti-capitalist? Yes, I am hardcore anti-capitalist. I have my reasons, but I think I've already mentioned where I stand on that. Gotta make it cost more not to. Sean Hensley, got to make it cost more not to? I don't know what that means. Aaron wants to get me kind of back on topic. And so Aaron's asking, so is the issue with Trump that he's ableist and mocking people, but liberals who play into it are just as ableist? I'd say they're more ableist because they should know better. I don't know if there's a degree of ableism going on here. I think that they are using their, I guess, physicality, using their able body to chastise each other when something breaks down and unexpectedly. Again, it's implying a negative connotation there. And I don't know if there's one is being more ableist than the other, one should know better than the other. I honestly think that so many people don't know, just because of the fact that there is a preference in our culture for able-bodied people. And a lot of the time, people with disabilities aren't considered. I was reading an article about COVID and ableism, and some of the concerns that people with disabilities and chronic illnesses have due to the COVID outbreak. And they fear, rightly so, because I think this is what happened in Italy. It had been reported that people with disabilities or chronic conditions were not being prioritized at all, were being basically left to die, and they would prioritize able-bodied people for like ventilators or care in Italy. And there is a long precedent of disliking anybody who's out of the norm in the United States. And I think that is a valid concern for people with disabilities or chronic illnesses. It is a question, will they be taken care of if they have COVID and need to be hospitalized for it? Will they actually get the care that they need that is equitable to the care of someone who is able-bodied? Legit concern. So yeah, it's a big conversation to have. And I think that something like that, like I was mentioning with the COVID, people aren't really actively thinking about those things. They're not thinking about people with disabilities and if they're going to be left out to dry, essentially. If COVID cases skyrocket in the United States, which they're already obviously pretty high to begin with. I think the US only makes up 5% of the population on Earth, or 3 or 5% of the population on Earth, but has like 30% of the COVID cases on the planet. So there is something going on in the US, and I think it's a fair point to be concerned if you have a disability or a chronic illness, whether you'll get treatment or not. There's also the fact that sometimes if you're in a wheelchair, you just can't get into the treatment facility because there isn't a ramp or the door isn't wide enough. So that's another thing. There's a lot of people I was reading that just don't go to doctor's offices sometimes because they're like, I can't get in the building. And so I don't know if this is the case for all of the states throughout the country, but I think many of the states somehow have found a way to get around the ADA and allows their buildings, allows their businesses to basically not be compliant. It's really annoying. Formerly Rodline asks, are mental disabilities also included? Hey, Shannon, are mental disabilities also included in this or just physical? Both mental and physical. I was mentioning earlier about hidden disabilities too. Those with maybe MS but aren't showing the signs physically of that condition, but they're still having some cognitive issues. That would be a hidden disability because it's not outright visible. And some of the things that, as far as mental disabilities are concerned, as far as ableists too is concerned, there's kind of the terminology we use, and again, that negative connotation being associated with a variety of conditions that frankly are quite normal. So we got, hey, that's retarded. Hey, that's insane. Those things, those are not appropriate terminologies to utilize. It's, because those things have historically been reserved for specific conditions, or the manifestation of a condition. And I think that we should also keep that in mind, that when we find ourselves using that terminology, we need to catch ourselves. I grew up in a time where people said retarded a lot. And so sometimes I say, hey, that's retarded. And then I catch myself, I'm like, ooh, never mind, disregard that. That's horrible to say. And it helps just being aware of that to help your language. And then you realize you're starting to use some of these negative terms less and less and less. So it's good. It's a good thing. Shannon Q mentions, she can relate, but also mentions that mental disabilities are demonstrated to be physical. Your brain is a material component of your physical body. Absolutely. And I think that this is a misconception about like the mind-brain dichotomy. I think that's where people are like, hey, is this a physical disability or a mental disability? It's both. Mental disabilities have a brain etiology a lot of the time, all of the time, actually. There's something going on. Even if researchers haven't discovered exactly what's going on in the brain, it's still something in the brain. And that gets to the fact of that hidden disability aspect. A mental disability might as well just be called hidden, because it's not right upon inspection, upon looking at an individual. It's not readily apparent that they may have some sort of disability. Joseph Green mentions, I think you just nailed it. Anybody out of the norm is still ostracized. Race, body type, physical or cognitive abilities, etc., perhaps remaining vestiges of eugenic past. I honestly think that eugenics is not past us. It's actually coming more into fashion, so to speak, especially with the rise of fascism. At least that's what I've been reading. Because I mentioned today on Twitter that I feel like the way in which COVID has been handled in the United States, it's low-key eugenics. Like, it's a way to basically kill off the quote-unquote undesirables, because COVID does disproportionately affect minority communities. COVID does disproportionately kill people who have underlying chronic conditions. So it may be intentional. I don't want to, that's a conspiracy theory. I know that, so don't think that, or don't take my word on this at all, because I have no evidence to prove it. But Stephen Miller, he's a bad guy, and he's pulling a lot of strings in the Trump administration. He's basically second in command, essentially. He's the one that's responsible for all of the immigration policies that are coming out. He is a rabid racist, and a rabid, basically, person. He's a bigot. Any condition, any problem, quote unquote problem, and any way in which your body differs from how Stephen Miller defines normality, he does not like you. He hates you and thinks you should die. Shannon Q says, I have to run off. Just want to say I adore you. Heart. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for joining us temporarily. It was nice seeing you too. So where was I? Yeah. So it's just unfortunate because I honestly kind of think that it is a form of eugenics, the way in which they handled it. And I think that people around Trump are smart enough to know that the way it's being handled is not okay if they cared. But maybe it's because they don't care, because they know it will impact certain people in society more, like the poors. So I just feel like that's a form of eugenics, and maybe it will be uncovered once the administration hopefully leaves, that that there was an intentional, uh, it was intentional the way in which the disease outbreak has been handled and is still being handled, actually. Formerly Rodline asks, you touched on one I've always wondered, is retarded still okay in the original sense? As I, chemical retardant. I think the chemical retardant, of course, is I think that's still used basically, because it does mean like to stop something or to slow something down. I think it still is used in that sense, in that classical sense, but not in a medical sense. It's no longer applied to human beings. But I think a retardant and retarded are kind of, while retarded does come from retardant essentially, I think that their meaning is so different too. And retarded is even kind of a different word in and of itself. Okay, so formerly Rod Line asks, how can you know if it's on purpose or if minorities are more affected because a larger portion live in crowded or urban areas? So I don't know, right? I mentioned that it's my conspiracy theory, so I have no evidence to support this as far as if it's intentional, the way in which they're handled. But I will tell you that other urban areas on Earth have not had as much problem as the United States. There are countries that have similar population sizes, similar kind of urban areas, and they do not have the amount of COVID cases as people in the US in those cities. And I think it's being underreported essentially too, and in rural areas as well. People are kind of dying from unrelated causes, but we're finding out now that COVID can result in some weird things happening, like strokes, heart attacks, and things that you wouldn't expect if it's kind of a respiratory illness, kidney failure even. So it affects a lot of body parts if it's able to, I guess, travel to that body part or to that organ. Excuse me. Okay, formerly Rodline says, thanks for explaining. I didn't know that about other countries. Okay, raw. Somebody needs to tell me how to pronounce this. Raul Duran Buristov mentions mask wearing helps a lot. Yes, wearing masks do help. And it's a real disservice that the federal government in the US basically said, no, it doesn't help initially, knowing that it did. So, and their reasoning for this was, well, we wanted this protective equipment to not get bought up by regular people. We wanted medical professionals to have all access to that first. I still don't think that justifies lying, essentially. They lied and said that it wasn't effective. And then all of these studies came out like, excuse me, it is. They lied. And so Raol. 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 Thank you. I think if I'm still pronouncing this wrong, let me know. Raol. Or Mr. President of France. Oh, I'm your VP still, right? Raul. That's what I thought it was, but then I was like, I don't know how to pronounce that the right way. It's Raul. Yay. So where was I again? Oh yeah, the disservice about not wearing masks. And it's weird because it's like, well, a lot of people just made their masks. They didn't buy any of that stuff. They just sewed a mask. They're using bandanas. They're using all sorts of things. I think I read some articles where people were using bra cups as masks. So that they did a real disservice, I think, early on, and they're still doing a disservice by basically giving the people the impression that the pandemic is essentially over just because they said it was. And that's not true. Cases are once again spiking. So just again, be careful out there. Do wear your masks if you have them. Hopefully you do. And yeah, do your best to social distance yourself and all that good stuff. Okay, there's one thing so formerly Rodline asks if anyone in chat knows what the WHO's original stance on masks was. Yes, it was to wear a mask. Did the CDC align with them on that? No, they did not. Another way that people don't realize that they're being ableist is by utilizing resources that are supposed to be for people with disabilities. And ladies, if there are any ladies in the chat, that also includes the handicap stall in the public restrooms. When I was more in my wheelchair, I had to use that exclusively, and it was always occupied, always by somebody. Like the first stall would not be occupied, but you sure as hell the handicap stall was, and it was occupied by someone who didn't need it. And then like every time they saw me too, this is also ableist, they would go, oh, I'm sorry. They would apologize for utilizing it. I'm just like, I just have to pee, okay? Go on. So that's something to be aware of. You know those like little lines essentially next to handicap parking spots? That whole area is supposed to be reserved for people in wheelchairs. So do not put your shopping cart in those lines. Do not park in them. You're being an asshole, essentially, if you're parking in those lines, because that whole thing is supposed to be for people with wheelchairs because they need a lot more room to get out of their vehicle, which is what those lines are for, is giving them that extra space. So just don't be an ass, essentially. Mark K mentions that we have the worst healthcare system in the world, so those on the bottom of our capitalist system are less likely to have access or can't afford medical care. I think we're not really the worst. Yes, we are. This is a complicated issue, and it has to do with how the statistics are reported. So when you look at people who are wealthy and who have access to healthcare, that they get really good care in the United States as long as they can afford it. And this kind of bumps up the healthcare metric like statistically, because look at the people who get excellent care. And so it kind of makes it seem like the US healthcare system is working somewhat. But then it also, so there, if you're poor, you aren't getting much care at all in this country. And people don't seem to care about that. It's almost as if they kind of justify it and say, hey, since you're poor, you don't deserve healthcare. Your medical needs are secondary. I think that this is, again, a form of eugenics by not offering quality healthcare to all of to anybody in the United States. And I mean anybody. If you are an immigrant, if you are, I guess, visiting, I still feel like you should have access to, you shouldn't just have access to healthcare, but you should have healthcare, period. Even if you're an immigrant. Okay, I have to show this because this is funny. Okay, Johnny Guillotine asks, or not asks, but says, someone once asked seriously, what are the handrails in the handicap stall for? My response was power shitting. I think about their stupidity often. Well, like, legit, sometimes people just don't know. And so I don't think it's a stupidity thing, it's an exposure issue. If you don't know anybody who has these problems, you may not know. And I keep saying problems, and that's ableist of me too. Anybody who has these disabilities or conditions, they just may not know. And I don't fault anybody for lack of knowledge. I will fault people for having the knowledge but disregarding it. That's a serious offense to me. John Hogan adds to that, ripping and tearing, that's what they are for. Yeah. Or maybe you kind of just like hold yourself like, you're on the parallel bars. Anybody know the reference? No? Okay. Gymnastics. Or willful. It's willful ignorance that I just cannot put up with. And I actually made some notes here, so I'm kind of making sure that I've gone through all of them. One of the things that I was looking for was how to not be ableist, right? How to avoid using, avoid basically discriminating, because that at the end of the day, it is discrimination. And even if it's kind of those microaggressions, like what Ted Lieu was doing with his superior ability to drink a glass of water compared to Donald Trump. He has the inferior ability of drinking a glass of water. Yeah, that makes me really angry. But a way to kind of make sure you don't, or you're not ableist is, like I mentioned, exposure is a good way. So if you're unsure of something, ask, like that person did who asked about what the handlebars were for. They asked you because they felt safe enough to ask you. I assume that when people ask me questions that I think are common knowledge, it's because they feel safe with my answer, and they're kind of embarrassed by their lack of knowledge. Like, that's what I assume. And I kind of assume that anyways. Like, I'm privileged to be able to answer people's questions, I think, if I have answers for you guys or for anybody. I take that very importantly. But yeah, just make sure that you have a diverse group of people. If you're ever doing some initiative or doing some volunteer work, getting volunteers together, and you want to find out the best way to go about, maybe canvassing or, speeches, giving speeches to the public. You may want to include somebody, maybe multiple people who have various disabilities, so that these things are accessible to everybody, regardless of their ability to move their body or not, or to see or not, or to hear or not. Johnny Guillotine guillotine, right? Not guillotine, it's guillotine. Do you say guillotine or guillotine? Because I've heard both in the US. People say both. But Johnny Guillotine or Guillotine says, they knew me. I can't feel my legs, but I can walk. They literally seen my work, me work myself from wheelchair to walking. Yeah, but they asked you because they have seen you. Maybe that's why they asked, because you would know better than anybody what those things are for, right? Again, I don't fault people for not having the knowledge. I will fault them for having the knowledge and then ignoring it. Okay, I used the hard L. All right, Johnny Guillotine then. Have I missed anything? So that, I think I've been on for an hour. That being the case, are there any questions you guys have or additional comments you may want to make? Maybe I'd like to, if you've had a story where somebody was behaving ableist to you, I think that would be interesting to know, because sometimes when you have these stories to tell people, it feels like you're the only one that ever has that experience. You know what I mean? And it's just, while it's not a great experience, at least other people have it, and able-bodied people can't go, well, we're trying to be nice to you. Get over it, and all those things, because that's gaslighting, right? And sometimes you are gaslit about these things. Torrential rage. Teach me statistics. No. Maybe. Notary S asks, can you teach? I may teach. First of all, what statistics would you like to learn? Just message me if you're really serious about it. Notary S says, can you touch on the racism is a mental illness argument? I can't, because I don't think it's a mental illness. I think it can cause things like, if you are a target of racism, there's a lot of evidence to support that you will be psychologically affected by that, just being targeted, and not even being like targeted for violence, but targeted as a discrimination, because you're more stressed, and stress has an impact on your brain, and yada, yada. I don't think it's a mental illness, though. I think it's a learned behavior and a learned habit. And people can unlearn these things. People have unlearned them. People have been rehabilitated, and so to speak, as far as they were once a white supremacist, and now, they're marching in Black Lives Matter protests. Those people do exist. I think one problem with racism, and why it kind of keeps perpetuating in society, is because people are so segregated still. And there's a long history of why that's the case. It was governmental. More recently, it was the government's fault for segregation. They did it intentionally. But we still have a society that's incredibly segregated, to the point where if you do not know people from other races and other ethnicities, other anything else, you can develop disregard towards them. White supremacy is so ingrained in US culture that that is the most prominent, thing that will happen, is a dehumanization of another race. I do subscribe to the idea that racism is a power effect too. So if you're a member of a racial minority and people may accuse you of racism, usually it's like that reverse racism bullshit, but people may accuse you of that. And I subscribe to the theory that the person being accused, that's a member of a racial minority, cannot be racist. It's impossible, because they live in a society where they are the minority and have less power or no power to enact racism or to harm someone else with racism, essentially, because they don't have the power to do so. And it's really that power that impacts racial minorities or religious minorities, because the people that are in the, I guess, their own in-group that have that power get to decide how they treat you or how society treats you. But I don't think it's a mental illness. It's a learned behavior. It's a habit. It's a fear-based habit too. And that's what makes it really complicated to unlearn too, because, fear is such a prominent emotion to have. It's very good to have when you actually need to fear for your life, but not so good when you live in a society where you don't really need to fear for that often, and then you have this kind of natural tendency, so to speak, to create in-groups and out-groups, and now it's a fear-based out-group that's targeted for racism. And these things are able to unlearn them. You're able to unlearn them if you have the exposure. And I don't think this is complicated too. It's complicated by the fact that racial minorities should not have the burden of rehabilitating white supremacists. Does that make sense? Like, they should not have, that should not be placed on their shoulders, because they are already being discriminated against in some way, shape, or form, that now they have to be responsible for exposing themselves to essentially dangerous positions. So just so white supremacists now know somebody who is a part of their outgroup, and they can demonstrate how they're not dangerous. That is not their job. And so that creates a complication, because racial minorities don't want to interact with white supremacists for good reason. So white supremacists won't get the exposure. They actually have to actively do it on their own. I don't know who made the suggestion. Let me see. Notary S. Who said that racism was a mental illness? I'm curious where this argument comes from, because I haven't heard that argument, but I'm interested. I do have 2 videos about racism, and one is racism based off of the racist, the brain mechanisms that are kind of active when people are being racist. And I also have another video that shows the effect of racism on targets of racism. It's detrimental. It's very bad. Just give you a heads up on that. But I don't think it's a mental illness. I think that's a bad way to think of it. Notary S, Okay, many folks on Twitter, particularly with respect to Karens calling cops, with respect to the Karens calling cops. I think it's a I know this is going to sound really weird. I think it's a cultural illness more than anything because of how it kind of continues to cycle in society needlessly too. There is a lot of resources, a lot of ways to expose yourself to other people. There's a thing that many Americans have access to, which is the internet. And it seems like instead of finding little clusters of your in-group that aren't racially diverse, you would expose yourself in that capacity, and they just don't. I think it's more out of fear. From all indication, it seems like it's a fear-based, I guess, a fear-based problem, that if they overcome their fear, the racism is non-existent. But yeah, I don't think I've never seen people make that argument that racism is a mental illness. I think it's a societal illness. It's accepted in society. It's kind of the standard if you think about it. I mean, think about even the US Constitution. Think about how the US was formulated. It was formulated to exclude people specifically based off of the color of their skin. So it makes sense why it's more of a cultural illness than a individual mental illness, so to speak, because it still is accepted in society through various things, like through the way policing is, criminal justice system, education, all of those things is race. They're racist. It's a racist system that many people are okay with not addressing, if anything, because they individually aren't part of the problem. But yes, they are. Your inaction is part of the problem too. FTW all day says, I think it can be fear, and sometimes I think it can be malicious. Malicious coming from, yeah. What Brad Bloom says, I was about to say that. Brad Bloom responded that FTW, yes, malicious, coming from a place of fear. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Maliciousness doesn't just come out of nowhere. A lot of it is a fear-based response initially anyways. And then it gives you that kind of negative connotation or that negative feeling, and then it moves into like distrust or hate or maliciousness, things like that. But it definitely begins with fear, and the media is not helping. Like Hollywood movies aren't helping, because there was a time where the black person, a black male, was always responsible for criminality in movies. Does anybody remember this? And it wasn't that long ago. And so if you're watching or if you're consuming those movies, and your children are too, because they're with you, they are afraid of black people because of what they saw on TV. And that's something that keeps cycling through society, and that's bad. And for the life of me, I don't know why it was acceptable that to use black people all the time as the antagonist in movies. I don't know why they did that and why it wasn't pointed out earlier. Aaron A mentions, I don't know if this was argued here, but calling racism a mental disorder is ableist because it's placing something inherently bad into this category you're trying to say is inherently bad. Absolutely, and that's something that I didn't consider. But you're right, it is ableist because mental illnesses aren't a negative thing. Again, they're just a thing that happens. I feel like if we lived in a better society, we would be fine with all the mental illnesses people have and be able to treat it if for some reason that mental illness was causing distress for that person. There are some people that are fine with their mental illness and don't want treatment. Not that they don't want it because they're suicidal or something like that, but because, you know, they have visions and they like having those visions and it goes away when you have treatment. And that's literally like the only thing that they have are, well, I say visions, but they're hallucinations, right? Um, so I think that, yeah, we should not associate such a negative thing with mental illness as if it's inherent, as if that negativity is inherent within mental illness to begin with. I think that's a really excellent point. Yeah, Brad Bloom mentions watch a cop movie from the 80s or even recently. There's a lot. Johnny Guillotine mentions that white supremacy is throughout the government. It has to uphold racism. That's why they would/will still treat Black people differently on how pain affects them. It is everywhere. I mean, you would be surprised. And Johnny Guillotine is mentioning something that is a problem with the healthcare system, essentially. Black people do not get prescribed opioids when they're in pain as white people do. And it's because doctors have this misconception that Black people are better able to handle pain. And so therefore they don't need the drugs. It's crazy. I was reading a study of people, of doctors and medical professionals, how they viewed or what they thought about different races, specifically Black and white people. And there was one that I was like, this is the craziest thing I've ever read as far as this is concerned. But it was, they believed that Black people literally had thicker skin than white people. Like their skin was thicker. What? How are you a medical professional? How did you get through how did you get through school if you believed something so stupid? Propaganda. I don't know why this was hidden, like held for review, but Brad Bloom says that white supremacy, racism, etc., is so pervasive in America. Exactly. And I feel like that's what's maintaining racism and white supremacy, is because it's upheld in systems. And it ends up being a subconscious thing too, because white supremacy is just built into the fabric of society. You can see this in like those apps that try to manipulate your face a little bit. It ends up lightening people's skin too. Why it does that, God knows. It's like these beauty apps or something. It's because the conception, I guess, of beauty in the United States is white or light skin, right? And it's just, it's not okay. But that's another way that white supremacy is reinforced. And that's just in the beauty part. And then you've got the medical part, then you've got the, law enforcement part. And so it's, yeah, Johnny Guillotine says, it's eugenics ass bullshit. Somebody says that Joseph made a good point, so I'm going to read it out loud. Joseph Green says, much mental illness is directly related to inherent inequities in society and being in the field. Sometimes I feel that we use mental illness as an excuse to avoid dealing with systemic unfairness. Yes, that's true. And a lot of mental illnesses spring out from the fact, generate from anxiety. And that can spiral out of control and manifest as depression now, or as bipolar disorder and things like that. And it's just from anxiety and stress. Stress because you don't have the resources that you need to survive, and you have to figure out how to get them. You live in an inequitable society where you know there is an abundance of resources, but it is being denied to you. That's frustrating too. And I think Joseph Green has an excellent point there. Will that, if like we had an egalitarian society where it was nonlinear and everybody had everything that they needed, etc., would that eliminate mental illness as a whole? I don't think so, but I think it would eliminate a lot of other things like anxiety disorders. It may eliminate the number of people who have major depressive disorders and things like that. But I don't think it will eliminate some of the more, I guess, severe disorders like schizophrenia. Oh, wow. Okay. Johnny Guillotine, just to reinforce my point about the medical issue here, medical systemic racism in the medical field. Johnny Guillotine said, I worked in surgery and seen them cut an infant with boils with nothing to help that child. The doctor said, he's a black baby. He don't really feel it. Shocking, right? It's shocking to me. When he was done with the procedure, before he unlocked the door, I beat his ass. And then all the other doctors I work with left surgery floor, went to the director of nursing and saved my job. I'm sure that's a really neat story. And I'm very happy that you did that, because that, in a weird way, that's a way to be an ally towards people that don't have the agency to do it themselves or can't do it themselves. It's good that somebody did that to them, because they needed to be corrected on that for sure. It was inappropriate for them to do that, absolutely. And they needed to get their ass beat. Let's just be real. They deserved it. The doctor was allowed to go elsewhere to practice. Yeah. Oh, okay. So he had a privileged life, it sounds like. The doctor inherited money from his dad and then quit working. Well, at least he's no longer affecting people's lives directly, at any rate. He cannot harm people by, performing some kind of surgery on someone who's Black and then not allowing them to have like the anesthetics or the analgesics to minimize the pain. That's harmful. That's a harmful behavior. And I'm happy that he's no longer practicing. Well, I am having such a great time talking with you guys. So I really don't know when to stop doing that, like when to cut my streams off, because I enjoy talking with you guys so much. And I feel awkward when I'm like, okay, it's been an hour. It's been an hour and 30 minutes. Bye. I don't know when to do that. But if it's okay with you, I would like to stop streaming. Just because I want you guys to not have to feel obligated to keep talking to me. I don't know what you're talking about, but that's okay. All right. So thanks for this as usual. Until next time, I'm thinking about doing something once a week. So that might be like next week, maybe next time. TY, thank you for the stream. All right, guys. So I will maybe see you guys next week. That'll be great. And I hope you guys have a great night. And I hope you guys, again, stay safe out there, social distance as much as possible, wear a mask when you leave the house. Oh, nice hair, by the way. Oh, it's so frizzy. Look how frizzy it is. It's just being chopped off. So you guys can't see how frizzy it is. Anyways, bye guys.